Morning again, and welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church as we continue our series on what is Anglicanism, Anglicanism 101. We are rapidly approaching the end of the historical portion of the lectures. As a matter of fact, next week we will look at the Elizabethan settlement briefly. After that, we'll look at the Oxford movement, and then we'll summarize. We'll give an overview of the historical portion before we move into the liturgical calendar and its impact on Anglicanism and Anglican worship, and then we'll get directly into the practical use of the Book of Common Prayer. So everybody will have the ability to bring their prayer books with them, and we will go through it section by section so that by the time we finish the course, you'll not only know what Anglicanism is, at least from the perspective of this Italian priest, you will also have a handle on all of the particulars of the Book of Common Prayer. You know, what the rubrics are, why they're important, what each section of the Book of Common Prayer is, why it is important for us. We'll look at morning and evening prayer, some of the other services that are contained. Anyway, that being said, let's look this morning at the conclusion of Key Figures in the English Reformation from a Protestant perspective. There are, as with the Roman side, there are so many important individuals that we will not be able to cover. One of them I'm actually going to mention in passing, Thomas Bilney, B-I-L-N-E-Y. It would behoove anybody to look at Bilney's impact as well. I want to start, however, with a name that most of us are probably, excuse me, that we will probably recognize, with which we're familiar. And I'm only going to mention a couple things. But his name was John Foxe. Anybody remember Foxe's Book of Martyrs? This is the gentleman that put it together. He was an historian, and he was a martyrologist. By all accounts, he probably was one of the most famous. I don't want to say he created martyrology, but the study of martyrs, but he certainly brought it to the forefront because in his book, Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which is actually called the Acts and Monuments, that's what it's called, Acts and Monuments. It's informally called Foxe's Book of Martyrs. For the most part, what he did was he chronicled all of the Protestant martyrs through the Reformation, which wound up almost de facto creating Protestant identity in the Reformation. Protestants became identified as martyrs because of what Foxe did. So, excuse me, something went down the wrong way. So, Foxe has it's kind of an ancillary, but it's a key part in forming not only the Protestant mindset during the Reformation, but in forming what Anglicanism was at this time. He lived from 1516 to 1587, so he himself was not a martyr. I mean, he lived a long time. He was 71 before he died. Okay, so let's look at the two principles this morning. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. Anybody that has any association or familiarity with Anglicanism or the Church of England or the English Reformation will recognize those two names, if for no other reason than the manner in which they died.
What was the second one, please?
Nicholas Ridley. I'll get to it, so if you didn't get it, don't worry about it. We'll get to him in a minute. Latimer was born in 1487, thereabouts, and he died in 1555. And that date should kind of send up a red flag, because that was right during Mary's reign. He was a prominent voice for reform under Edward VI. One of the most influential preachers of the English Reformation, and ultimately he was a Protestant martyr. He was born in Leicestershire, and I'm sure I've mispronounced that, but that's the town. He's a Cambridge graduate, and he was originally a staunch Roman Catholic and a critic of Luther. He wound up frequenting, I'm not sure if this is directly connected to theology, which may explain my weakness in theology, but he frequented a place called the White Horse Inn, which was an English pub. And there he encountered a group of men, and they would Billy, Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer, and others, and they would discuss Luther's ideas from the continent. And this is what winds up becoming the groundswell for Lutheran ideas within the English church. And it was Bilney who influenced Latimer, who subsequently influenced Ridley, towards Reformation and evangelical ideas and theology. Latimer was one of the most powerful and popular preachers in England, and he emphasized direct access to Scripture, the need for personal faith, and criticized corruption within the clergy. That almost should be a mantra for this entire section, going back as far as we can remember into the Middle Ages. It is a sad commentary on Christianity that, as we've gone through over, now we're looking at what, 600 years of church history. One of the more common themes throughout this entire period is clergy corruption and moral infidelity. It's just heartbreaking to see that this is what the history of the church is, and the sad part is there's not much change today. I mean, we see it happening all the time, whether it's Ted Haggard, whether it's Jimmy Swaggart, whether it's Baker, doesn't matter. We had a movie in the 50s that was dedicated to this. Anybody ever see Elmer Gantry? The great evangelist, Burt Lancaster. Anyway, who was a con man. Latimer was initially very popular with Henry VIII. He favored Henry. Henry favored him greatly because Latimer supported Henry's divorce from Catherine. Of course, Latimer's position was a theological defense of Henry's contention rather than a political one. He was appointed the Archbishop of Worcester in 1535, and as bishop, he pushed for reforms. He encouraged English Bible reading. He attacked idolatry and superstition, and you can put in parentheses with that their perception of Roman practice. That's the manner in which almost all of the English reformers would refer to what Rome did. They called it superstition and idolatry. I'll leave your study to Rome to determine whether Roman theology actually does lend to that. There are cases that it can be made, and there are cases I think they overstep their bounds. In 1539, there was contention between Henry and Latimer because of Henry's 6 articles, which supported transubstantiation. And Latimer, amongst other doctrines, and Latimer just had no truck with that. So he resigned. He resigned as bishop, he resigned as a clergyman, and he spent the last portion of Henry's reign in, quote, semi-retirement. He remained respected among the reformers, but he wasn't a bishop and he wasn't preaching regularly. Well, Henry dies, and in 1547, for the next 6 years, Edward VI, Henry's son, the Protestant king, comes to the throne. And with Edward's ascension comes Latimer's resurrection, if you will, to public preaching. He delivered numerous famous sermons at Edward's court, reinforcing evangelical reform and contributing to the shaping of the Protestant identity in England. You'll see with the men that we have spoken of, Hooper, Parker, Latimer, Ridley, and the collection of individuals, you will see that here's the core, Cranmer included, here's the core of the English Reformation that starts to define what Anglicanism is at this time, which is why we get into the discussions that we have today with people arguing over what Anglicanism is. Because what they do is they stop at this time period historically. And then they become entrenched, and then they become ossified, and the only thing that is really Anglican is what takes place during the 16th and the 17th centuries. It's as if everything before that didn't exist, and if it existed to support this time. And we've seen that that's just not the case. There was tension. It was almost as if the Church of England lived with two opposite extremes in her head, constantly battling as she moved forward. But, that said, Latimer is a part of the group that spends a lot of capital on defining Anglicanism as Protestant. In 1553, Mary ascends to the throne at the death of her younger brother, and with Mary's ascension, we start seeing the rounding up and arrests of Protestant reformers. Latimer was arrested by Henry. Latimer was tried for heresy with Nicholas Ridley and Cranmer. And he was burned at the stake on the 16th of October, 1555, alongside of Nicholas Ridley subsequently. And we know that Cranmer was also martyred at this time. He first signed the recantation of his views, and then as he pondered and weighed and prayed before coming out, he determined that he was wrong, and he recanted his recantation. And when Mary sent him to the throne, or to the stake, the first thing he did was he thrust the hand that he signed the recantation into the fire first. So we have the three great Protestants martyred at this time, and this date, not this date, but October 16th, in 1555, lends itself to one of the great phrases and quotes that has been passed on throughout not only English history, but church history, especially when it involves the Reformation. And as they were led to the stake and tied to the stake, just before the flames were lit, Latimer looked over at Ridley, who was his junior by 13 years. He looked at Ridley and he said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And depending upon who you talk to, that's true. His death made him one of the most iconic Protestant martyrs of the Marian persecutions. To stand there and, if you've ever dealt with fire or burnt yourself on a fire, I'm not talking about stove, I'm talking about a flame. To know that that is about to happen, and to be able to turn to a colleague, a younger man, and tell him, play the man. Don't succumb to your fear, even though right now you're about to be set on fire, is an incredible act of will and bravery. And of course, as you would expect, he was a featured martyr in Fox's Book of Martyrs, which of course, as the book became popular through circulation, cemented Latimer's position almost in royalty of martyrs, if you will. So just a quick summary, he was a Catholic priest turned Protestant reformer. His fiery sermons and eventual martyrdom made him a leading figure of the English Reformation, and his preaching helped spread evangelical ideas. And his death under Mary I became a rallying point for the English Protestant identity. Infallibility of Scripture over tradition, the necessity to read the Scripture for the congregants to have the Bible in their hands, condemnation of clergy, malfeasance, all speak of Ridley's part in continuing the critique of the church, the reform of the church, and subsequently in his death. Well, his young apprentice, if you will, not necessarily, but Nicholas Ridley was born around the 1500s. He became the Bishop of London, and he supported Protestant theology and reforms as influenced by the White Horse Inn group. He was one of the most important figures of the English Reformation, particularly during Henry's and Edward's reigns, Henry VIII and Edward VI. He played a central role in shaping the doctrinal and liturgical direction of the English Church. He became one of the most famous Protestant martyrs under Mary. He was born in Northumberland, and his family was financially well off. He was educated at Cambridge, and as I said, Oxford and Cambridge sort of became the demarcation point throughout English clerical training. Oxford being the more Anglo-Catholic, actually more Roman, and Cambridge being the more Protestant. You can see, as we've talked about, Hooper and Parker and Latimer, and really all of these reformers went to Cambridge. He then, if that wasn't enough, he went to Paris and he studied at the Sorbonne. And this introduced him to what was going on in the continent, particularly the continental humanism, in which Calvin and Butzer and Luther and all of the other main continental figures were influenced. Erasmus had a very powerful influence on the issue of humanism at this time. Humanism, a brief second. humanism in the Christian context, not the secular humanism that we talk about today. What is the nature of man? What is humanity's interaction with humanity, all with an overarching Christian understanding of the dignity and value of man. So they didn't exclusively refer to church dogma, but they never separated the continental humanism from God's overarching influence in the discussion, unlike today, where secular humanism is something entirely different. He became royal chaplain, actually. By the 1540s, he had joined Archbishop Cranmer and the Reformist circle, welcome Whitehorse Inn, and he was appointed the Bishop of Rochester in 1547 and later the Bishop of London in 1550. His doctrinal influence was most notably seen in both liturgy and in his advocacy of sola scriptura. And once again, I'm going to say this so that we're not confused. Sola scriptura does not mean solo scriptura. It doesn't mean the Bible only. Sola scriptura means that the Bible is the only infallible rule of faith and doctrine, not the only authority. It is the only infallible authority. Tradition and reason are also authorities within the church, specifically within Anglicanism. Ridley rejected transubstantiation, of course, and he taught instead a spiritual presence in the Eucharist, and this creates some concern because when we talk about using the phrase spiritual presence, we have to demarcate that from what Zwingli was arguing. And unfortunately, Ridley's position probably leans Zwinglian. In other words, it's just a symbol. Okay? It's not sacramental. This became a major theological voice, made him a major theological voice, and indicated a major shift in Protestant sacramental doctrine. So it kind of creates a concern in liturgical studies when we talk about Ridley's understanding of what the Eucharist was. Is it a sacramental presence of the full person of Christ? Or is it a spiritual presence where you are united to Christ's body through your subjective faith? That becomes a very, very key issue. In my opinion, his most prominent, I guess I shouldn't cover the mic, his most prominent and important contribution to the Reformation at this time was his influence in the 1549 and the 1552 editions of the Book of Common Prayer. He was very, very important in that. He was known for liturgical reforms. He encouraged removal of the altars replaced with communion tables, emphasizing a meal-like character of the Lord's Supper. He oversaw reforms in London churches that embodied Edwardian Protestantism. So you can see when we talk about Ridley and Latimer, we're moving to what we would identify historically as evangelical English Anglicanism, understood to be low church. Historically, that's how low church was defined. It was defined as being evangelical. Emphasis on scripture, emphasis on witnessing. I don't know what is in there. Emphasis on witnessing, emphasis on the spread of the gospel, retreating, if you will, from more formal ceremony and more formal ritual, which became identified as idolatrous and superstitious. as I said. Some areas they may be right, but they went too far. A lot of what you see in these type of reform movements is a throwing the baby out with the bathwater situation. It's knee-jerk and it's reactionary. And we still have that today. I can point to a man that's 2.5 hours from here. And if he sees you investments, you're a Roman Catholic, period. That's it. Doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter what you say. If I showed up in the chasuble, boom, you're a papist. There's no serious scholarship. There's no serious intellectual analysis. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. And that's what we have today, not only in the church, in Anglicanism, but that's in Christianity. We are sloppy, lazy thinkers. We just are. And the world has every right to criticize us for that, because we don't do anything to correct that. When Edward died in 1553, Ridley supported Lady Jane Grey as the Queen instead of Mary. You can just imagine what that did for his reputation in the court and how he was viewed. And he was hoping, as most were, that the 9-day queen would have become the permanent queen, because she was every bit as Protestant as Edward VI was. And if you really want to read some very, very interesting and telling discussions, go back and read Jane's interaction with the Catholic bishops. This is a 16-year-old girl going toe-to-toe with some of the sharpest Roman minds at the time. And she's embarrassing them. It's quite a picture. Well, needless to say, that did not materialize. Mary ascended to the throne, and Ridley was arrested for heresy. He was arrested and later tried for heresy. And in October, along with his friend and mentor, Hugh Latimer, he was burned at the stake. Their deaths, of course, both of them become prominent in Fox's Book of Martyrs. Of course, the famous quote by Latimer is attached to Ridley as well. And it really places both of them as Protestant heroes, if you will, because of that. Well, obviously because of their actions, but because of that one statement being constantly repeated. His significance cannot be understated. He was a doctrinal architect, helping establish a reformed theology for the Church of England, especially regarding the Eucharist. And when we talk about reformed, we have to be careful to distinguish between reforming a church and the continental Reformed theological perspective, i.e. Calvin. Ridley probably would have straddled the fence on that, leaning more towards Calvin, but not, I don't think, demonstrably so. His insistence on scripture-based worship, I put that in quotes, and the replacement of altars influenced Anglican identity during this time period. Man, oh man. This becomes, as it starts to seed and come to fruition, this becomes the cudgel against which the Oxford movement responds. And we'll get to that in 2 weeks. Because there's a positive aspect of the Oxford movement and there's a negative aspect of the Oxford movement. Nobody talks about the positive aspect because they are reactionary and they want to have this knee-jerk, slanderous perspective, so that anytime you call somebody an Anglo-Catholic, you're automatically assuming they're Anglo-Roman, they're Anglo-Papist. I'm sorry, there's something in my lungs here. But it begins here. It's with Latimer and Ridley and this period within the English Reformation that marks this turning point, and it becomes, well, we'll see when we get to the Oxford movement, but from this point forward, as we move forward within the Church of England, the Church of England goes from having this internal battle between high church and low church to going right down to low church. And by the 17th century, I'm going to stop, but let's just say by the 17th century we're low church, and I'll describe it when we get there in 2 weeks. But that becomes the impetus for the launching of the Oxford movement. And then, of course, as in the early church, in the first few centuries, martyrs become de facto moral authorities. If you were worthy enough to suffer for Christ in such a way as your suffering mirrored his suffering in death, well, whatever you said in life tops the cake, because you lived it. Whether that's justified or not, this becomes the mindset, especially as we move through the Middle Ages into the Reformation. And for the Church of England, it becomes a symbolic power for English Protestantism. You got guys, and let's be clear, both sides were killing each other. But Mary, let's just say Mary was really efficient in rounding people up and having them killed. She was really efficient at it. And of course, when you die for what you believe, you acquire this moral authority, and it has been the backdrop for all historical criticism of Mary moving forward. In her attempt to rectify the heresy of the Protestant English Reformation, as in most cases, it backfired on her. And rather than squelching it, it did what Tertullian said in a different context: the blood of the martyrs. The seed of the church is the blood of the martyrs. So Mary winds up essentially shooting herself in the foot. Okay. That's Latimer and Ridley. Any questions? Nothing?
I have a couple.
Yes, ma'am.
At that time, were they called Protestants? This is a protest of the way the Roman Church was. Were they called Protestants?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the humanism in the Christian context.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reason that it was even a discussion then?
It was just, you remember the social climate at the time. You have the poor, you have people that are downtrodden, you have the, you have vagabonds. There's a question, not necessarily as we talk about it openly today, but there's this this thing in the background of what is human dignity? Is there such a thing as human dignity? What is the value of life? I mean, people dying in the street. I mean, remember, we're not that far outside of the Black Plague. where we lost a third of Europe. What's going on? I mean, this created the whole Candide opera. No, nobody. Okay. Voltaire. Voltaire wrote a play. We're coming out of the Black Plague, and then there was this massive earthquake in Spain. Massive earthquake. It killed hundreds of thousands. And Voltaire's foil at the time was Leibniz, who was a religious theologian, let's say. And Leibniz had an argument for the existence of God, and out of his argument for the existence of God, when people looked at the world, they said, how could there be a good God when there is this thing that just took place where all of these people were killed? How can you say that there's a good God when there's such evil in the world? And Leibniz, as the philosopher, turned around and he basically said, and believe me, this is a really simplistic presentation of Leibniz. He said, in the course of all of eternity, God in his omniscience knows what each iteration of the world would have been had he created them. He knows, right down to the last hair of the last person. And this, the one we're living right now, is the best of all possible worlds. Now, if you've done any reading at all, or you've watched any movies, that phrase always comes up. The best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire wrote this scathing attack against Leibniz. Using that phrase, it became literally the conclusion of almost every song in the play. People running through the streets, killing people, but this is the best of all possible worlds. Fires collapsing on theater houses. People running out screaming, on fire, dying, but this is the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire just brutalized Leibniz. The value of human life. Is there any value of human life? If there's a God, how can we say that there's any value of human life when all of this goes on? Look at what just happened in Spain. Look at the Black Plague. Yada, yada. So the humanists, from the Christian standpoint, start to look at the human condition. They look at the scene. Now, this is only one aspect of it, of course, but this is what winds up coming to the fore, and this is where Erasmus and the other Christian humanists begin to focus on the interaction. This becomes very critical when you look at Calvin, because Calvin was weaned on French humanism. I mean, he's from Lyon, France. He comes very close to the Sorbonne, where French humanism was thriving, and his perspective on the interaction between God and man comes from a foundation, philosophic foundation, of French humanism. So this is why it winds up coming up in the discussion. This is how it winds up creeping into theology. This is why Luther then goes after Erasmus, not because he's opposed to humanism, he's opposed to what Erasmus had done with the impartation of humanism on theology, turning theology more subjective, turning theology more into a focus on man rather than theosology, study of God. So, no good deed goes unpunished. So, all right? Going once? No? You're just tired of this? Let's get out of here. We're done. Sick of history, right? All right. Okay, now, morning prayer, if I can find that. There we go.